funny, we were talking about hugs, and they were talking about hugs. And, you know, some people, I was just in Australia with a fellow who was creating a compassion center, and his wife was telling me how much he dislikes hugs. So every time or his girlfriend, so every time I would see him, I would hug him. And finally he got to the point where he said, okay, I give up. You can hug me whenever you want. And then, so I was going to the airport, and I'm leaving. He goes, can I give you a hug? And then he sent me a note and said, I finally get it now. And so it was quite sweet. And then the other story I'll tell you about hugs real quick is we had a summer research institute. And so, of course, we had graduate students, postdoctoral students, scientists. And at the end of that, and it was a wonderful event, we had a party. And I actually raised a toast to the people at the party, thanking them for the students for attending, the scientists, and our benefactors for actually funding it. So, Stephanie, where's Stephanie Brown? Is she here? Stephanie Brown, who has been on the stage a few times, was there. And at that event, she said, Jim, would you mind if I made a toast? And I said, of course. And she did. And she thanked me for supporting this work and things like that. And so at the end of it, I gave her a hug. So then a student stands up who was attending, and he said, Doctor, would you mind if I read a poem? And I said, oh, okay, read a poem. So he did this wonderful poem, and then he gave a toast. And then I gave him a hug, because I felt I had to give him a hug. So I said, and I had just met Amma. Do you guys know Amma, the hugging guru? So about 2 weeks before, I had met Amma and gotten this hug, right? So at this event, I said to these people, and there were about 60 people there, I said, you know, I feel like Amma. You know, I've given these hugs. And so the scientist says, well, I want a hug. This is a senior scientist there. And I look over, and so he comes over, and I give him a hug. There were 60 people at this event. All 60 lined up for a hug. Now, this is the most extraordinary thing in the world, right? I mean, 60, and these are not fluffy people. These are, like, sometimes not nice people. No, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, it was extraordinary. And what's amazing about it is half of them were laughing hysterically, and half of them were crying. So isn't that an amazing thing? So we shall begin.
We were joking backstage just now that my role in today's conference has been border collie. Backstage, herding all the speakers and keeping us on schedule. And so I have to take a breath and change roles now and step into the opportunity to tell you about this exciting work that Lloyd Dean mentioned this morning. In collaboration with Dignity Health, CCARE has brought together a team of researchers to engage in a literature review crossing the social sciences and the medical literature to unearth anything that we could find that would shed light on the claim or the question, does kindness heal? And so I have the opportunity to tell you about some of the work of that team, and I want to acknowledge my fellow researchers who have been pulling together the massive amount of evidence and sorting through it to see what we could learn. As you've heard today, there's a sea change going on in the social sciences, where what is called methodological individualism is still alive and well, but being quite challenged by all of the evidence that you've heard today about the fact that we are interconnected beings, that our personal well-being is deeply affected by the state of other people around us. This sea change is so profound and being driven by many of the people that you've had a chance to hear talk today, that the wonderful primatologist Frans de Waal has said that this line between selfishness and altruism is so blurred now that we need a new paradigm. And so we are, all of us in the room, engaged in creating that new paradigm. And as we've also heard today, the need is urgent. I won't go into any statistics on burnout because you just had the experts here talking with you about it, but the need is urgent among patients. A survey by the Schwartz Center for Compassionate Care across the United States found that less than 50% of patients said that they had received anything like compassion as a part of their interaction with the healthcare system. The need is urgent on the part of clinicians and care providers, and the need is urgent as a society for all of us to foster health and well-being and to spend our resources as wisely as we possibly can. So, undertaking a scientific investigation of the question, does kindness heal, required first that we just start out by asking, what do we mean by kindness? And as a scientific endeavor, we have to be pretty specific about what we mean by kindness because it's going to have implications for what we later would want to measure or test, or what we would include and exclude in our review. We began defining kindness by actually going into philosophy. And we found a wonderful philosopher of kindness who illuminated a definition that we have adopted. And I want to draw attention to 3 parts of this definition that are meaningful for scientific engagement. The first is that by kindness we mean purposeful, voluntary activity. If I accidentally hold the door open and you walk through it, that was not an act of kindness. It was an accident. If I purposefully open the door because I wanted to help you through it, that's an act of kindness. Undertaken with sensitivity to the needs of others. It's a very important part of the definition because, as you heard earlier, there's growing emphasis on empathy, not only in healthcare, but throughout the social sciences, and beginning to unpack and understand the exquisite physiology, neuroscience, and social sensitivity that links us together so that we might be housed in separate skin, but we aren't actually separate beings. We're quite sensitive to one another, and that's an important part of the science of kindness. And third, actively directed toward well-being or flourishing. This separates kindness from compassion. You've heard a lot of definitions of compassion today, which typically is defined as engagement with suffering. We have defined kindness more broadly, but to encompass some aspects of compassion. This is activity undertaken to foster well-being or flourishing of another. And as we've started to pull this work together and make sense of it, we've adopted a Cascade model, which comes from social psychology. And what fits in what part of the cascade might be a source of debate for the scientists in the room, but let me just point out a couple of interesting things about this cascade. First in the cascade is perception, by which we might mean the ability to detect the need or the state of others. So much of the discussion of empathy that includes experiencing with or feeling with or tapping into the feelings of others would relate to this ability to be sensitive to the needs of others. And even right now, you can start to see a research agenda form because, as we heard from Jamil today, the term empathy includes a lot of things that actually medical researchers don't often break out. It includes some cognitive perspective taking. It includes emotional dimensions. It includes what was called empathic concern, how much I actually care about the feelings of others. It includes how accurate I am at assessing others. And it's affected greatly by how similar or different I might think that I am from that other. In the Cascade model, this ability to detect the need or the state of others then feeds into, am I motivated or do I desire to take any action on behalf of the other whose state I'm capable of tuning into? And as we heard today, there's growing, interesting evidence that there are physiological underpinnings for being motivated to undertake action on behalf of others, and that these have direct implications for how we then choose to act, so for behavior. And I just heard one question at the end of the last panel about what do you mean by acts of compassion, or in this case, acts of kindness. So we are including many aspects of giving, helping, also maintaining an active presence with another, listening, sharing information, or being engaged in dialogue or conversation, all as behaviors that relate to kindness. And the fourth aspect of the cascade are the consequences of detecting the needs of others, caring about those needs enough to act on them, and then being interconnected and having your activity matter for the person that you're acting with and toward. And much of the work of the practitioners that you've heard today is focused on what are the consequences. How can we measure those consequences? How can we make a case that those consequences matter so that we can get other people in our organizations to pay attention to them? But the kinds of documented consequences that you've heard today, and I'll repeat, are greater psychological well-being, reduced stress, reduced anxiety, many ways of tapping into greater physical well-being and health outcomes, reduced pain, and measures of satisfaction, measures of engagement, and measures of adherence to treatment protocols. If we look toward what this review opens up about what we still need to know, some of the questions might sound quite general, but it really opens up space for us to think differently about what work exists and what's possible. So, what can we learn about the role of empathy in engendering greater kindness in healthcare? As I already mentioned in discussing the cascade, that word empathy needs a lot of unpacking. And if we want to create a scientific research agenda to investigate this question, we'll need to go much more deeply into unpacking different dimensions of empathy and different kinds of sensitivity to the needs of others. What kinds of interventions would support the desire to be kind in healthcare? Dr. Porges talked to us about just being physiologically ready to engage in pro-social activity. And what are the interesting things that we could implement in organizations that help people feel more ready and more desirous of undertaking activity on behalf of others? Behaviors. What kinds of expressions are most effective in healthcare settings? Bridget Duffy mentioned that communication was her #1 complaint across 12,000 complaints. Actually, one of the most common kind behaviors in organizations is talking. So just how do we talk to one another? What do we know about communication that could facilitate kindness in healthcare? There's an interesting array of research questions to be investigated there. And finally, consequences. We mentioned many consequences. We can look at consequences just for patients, just for families, just for caregivers, but what I think is so interesting that Robin Youngson mentioned is, what if we started looking at them as linked? What if we started looking at the way that caregivers are flourishing and how their patients also flourish? What if we started measuring them together instead of separately? What new kinds of research could we do to investigate consequences in new ways and bring this new science of pro-sociality to bear on these questions about outcomes? And so I'll leave you with a list, which is the kind of lists that scientists compose, and this is just a few of the many, many, many studies that we have read. But what we know by looking at resilient responses to adversity is that 3 categories of things really matter. Do we feel that we have a purpose in what we're doing? Do we feel connected to each other? And do we have the agency to engage in what we need to do? And as we look at these kinds of documented effects, I think it invites us to ask some different questions that we might borrow from positive psychology or positive organizational scholarship like Mandy and Laura were just talking to you about. So in addition to patient satisfaction, could we start asking about patient and family and provider feelings of love? In addition to measuring stress and anxiety or reduced exhaustion and burnout, could we measure engagement, which many of you probably do? Could we measure flourishing? Could we measure joy? In adherence to protocols, instead of looking for obedience, could we measure ease? How easy is it to take care of yourself and do what you need to do to take care of yourself? In addition to reduced pain, could we measure increased purpose? Has your experience increased your sense of the purpose of what you want to do with the time remaining that you have? And this assessment of health outcomes directly is amenable to many more scientific endeavors to engage in randomized controlled trials where, as part of the trial, we include the caregiver-patient relationship as a part of what's being manipulated, and we assign people to conditions in ways that make it much more clear that we can claim the kinds of effects that we want to claim to make the case for kindness in our healthcare. Thank you.
Our next speaker, Kathryn McDonald.
Hi, everyone. Is everyone still awake? Ready for continuing to consider the future and this area of relational coordination. So I want to open by just thanking the conference organizers. I've been very excited to be able to speak at this conference because I knew I'd learn a lot throughout the day, and I certainly have. I've been working really closely with researchers at Brandeis University and want to express my gratitude to Jody Hoffer-Gattel, who spoke, I think, at this conference last year about relational coordination. So if you heard that, you may have heard a little bit of this, but there's always new developments, and I'll be focusing on those. I also want to express some gratitude for somebody that I hadn't met when I had to put these slides together, and that was a nurse who was involved in my care yesterday. Her name was Francesca, and she was rather hurried and a little bit, brusque, maybe even gruff. And I was having a sub-diaphragmatic procedure that people tell you the prep is worse than the procedure, but I think both are pretty challenging. So that's a very nice way of saying what went on yesterday. Anyway, Francesca's job was to take me back to the room and have me change my clothes and lie down and become a patient. And she was doing everything that the nurses are supposed to do. She was getting an IV in me. She was telling me that I shouldn't operate power tools later in the afternoon and make any big decisions, and but that tomorrow I'd be fine. And I said, well, that's good because I have to give a talk tomorrow. And I was actually really trying to connect with her because she was so busy just doing everything, and I knew she was in a rush. I knew they were behind. I'd been in the waiting room for an hour, and but I needed that connection, right? I was the patient. I was now, in fine form, and so I was kind of making a play at the humanistic thing. And it worked. So she's, oh, what are you talking about? I said, oh, healthcare organizations and compassion and relational coordination. And her response was like perfect because she gave me my talk. It was amazing. She goes, oh, well, I hope it's compassion for like other workers. Yeah, that's part of it, not just the patient. I mean, other workers. People can be so rude. Like, yeah, it's really important to have a supportive environment. Just, yeah, everybody's busy, and some piece of equipment isn't working, and everybody has to look at who to blame. And I'm like, yeah, I know. It's really hard to have compassion in that kind of environment. And she just opened up, and she just kind of laid out all of the reasons that what I'm going to talk about in terms of relational coordination, why it matters. She talked about how important it was to care about the worker bees, the housekeeping staff, to have respect, how they have patients who are CEOs, but they never see their own CEO, and it would be really helpful if the folks at the top knew what was going on at the front lines. And it just, I mean, it just was perfect. I forgot about the fact that I was going to have a procedure, and I just felt like, you know what, I am involved in research in an area that's so vital, and that I like to see solutions and improvement, and I had hope for our future if some of the research that I'm aware of and I'm going to share actually gets absorbed. So here's the real talk. That was the extra. I'm going to talk a little bit about why we need better care coordination, what relational coordination is, RC as I'll term it, what we know about, through that relational coordination lens about the patient experience and about the medical practitioner experience, and then what we're seeing is promising interventions to improve relational coordination and outcomes, and then looking at predictors, you know, in terms of a forecast for a warmer future, knowing that now that getting heated up is a good thing. Relational leadership and co-production, relational co-production with the patient around delivering compassionate care using relational coordination theory. So this is kind of the roadmap to the future. An Institute of Medicine report in 2003 is still very relevant. The current system shows little cooperation and teamwork. And if you think about it, you know, the people who are working in the healthcare environment get worn down when teamwork doesn't work well. And that's what this nurse was expressing. That's what Francesca was expressing. And it's still true. The opposite of this is having good relational coordination, which I'll give you an idea of what that is. So relationships shape the communication through which coordination occurs. And it's shaped through the many roles that are involved in a patient's care. It's connecting around that person who's at the center. And it's a cast of many workers in specific roles working together. And this can happen for better, with shared goals, shared knowledge, mutual respect, and communication that's frequent and timely and accurate and problem solving. Or it can happen for worse, where there's functional goals, there's specialized knowledge, there's a lack of respect, communication isn't frequent enough, it's delayed, it's not always accurate, it's erroneous sometimes, and there's finger pointing, that blame that Francesca was noting when equipment fails. This process, whether it's for better or for worse, is called relational coordination. So it's about communicating and relating for the purpose of task integration. When it's going well, that would be a higher level of relational coordination. When it's going poorly, it would be a lower level of relational coordination. And it's measurable. Because it's measurable, there have been a lot of research so far, and this is kind of the past and still happening, showing associations between better relational coordination, so higher levels of relational coordination, that coordination among roles, is associated with better patient and family effects. A number of dimensions, from satisfaction to well-being to engagement. There's one study here at the bottom, which was from 9 hospitals, surgical patients, and patient satisfaction was better, freedom from pain was better, mobility was better, with higher levels of relational coordination. Similarly, better relational coordination is associated with better medical practitioner effects on very many different outcomes in a number of different studies. At the bottom, the one was on relational coordination in nursing homes among nursing aides and dietary staff and others, and job satisfaction was higher in nursing homes with better relational coordination. Okay, so there's an association, but can you improve relational coordination? And the model of organizational change that's developing and being tested now with interventions has these 3 green boxes. So there are potentially structural interventions that would be theorized to enable relational coordination, and those would be stuff that the sort of top level, that the leadership would probably need to invest in. Things like, you know, working out the proper approach for, you know, meetings and huddles and creating the right systems of accountability, even designing spaces, lots of kind of structures of organizations. Then relational interventions where you're creating psychological safety, like we heard in the talk about the culture of emotion. That's going to be kind of a collaboration between frontline leaders and top leaders in terms of thinking about interventions that would work in that space. And then the third area of interventions are more work process interventions, process mapping, structured problem solving. These are probably going to bubble up from the front lines more to be really effective. All of these are hypothesized, and there's interventions now that are showing that they're related to improving relational coordination and improving the performance outcomes. There's a couple working papers that are posted on the Brandeis Relational Coordination Research Collaboration site on all these studies that provide this information about the effects of RC at this point. But new frontiers, since this is a future-oriented thing, have to do with thinking about relational co-production. So you have first relational coordination where you're trying to do task integration, but then what about connecting medical providers with the patient and the family and the community? That's co-production. And then thinking about leadership, there's relational leadership, connecting the medical frontline practitioners, the managers there, and the executive leadership. What Francesca was talking about those CEOs who are off far away, bringing those leadership functions into a coordinated approach. These are three sort of mutually supporting dynamics: relational co-production, relational coordination, and relational leadership that bring together the patients, the practitioners, and the leaders as a three-part leverage system to get at being able to have the right structures and relationships and processes of care. There's wonderful new research coming out of a researcher in Denmark, Carson Horn, who talks about relational leaders creating connections, coordination of understandings, expectations, emotions, and actions in constant interaction with the organization's many internal and external stakeholders for the purpose of helping the organization achieve its goals. Being a leader means that one must actively position oneself in relation to individuals and tasks and proactively help create awareness, relations, connections, and clarification. This is work that he's done in terms of examining social services and healthcare services for dementia patients. So basically, there's got to be a shared goal at all these levels of relational coordination, co-production, and leadership that's all relationally based, shared among the different stakeholders and around patient-focused, compassionate care to allow us to envision a delivery system where all the parties would find ways to change their organization to enable work to be coordinated to deliver on such a shared goal. If you think about that, you could imagine the future. And this future would be an organization that has a mission to deliver compassionate, patient-focused care using these kinds of relational coordination lessons where patients appreciate what we do and people cherish working here, that both parties are having an experience where they're feeling the hugs. So, if you take one, this is just imagining, this is where we want to go in the future and use all the findings from this conference. What people in the system might say about their work, they might say, our hospital or nursing home or clinic or whatever organization is set up with structures and processes that allow us to work together easily and effectively with an aim of using all members of the team's expertise. No one is more or less important in understanding patients and helping them get the care that meets their needs and preferences. We ask patients and their families what they want, whether there's more we can do to help. You want this from anyone on the care team. And Francesca told me yesterday, the housekeeper, we've got to respect the housekeeper. Then what patients and families might say about their experiences in the system. I was so worried when I went there and felt welcomed and cared for. Everyone wanted to understand what I was experiencing and help me get better. It was a slow process because of my terrible accident, but I'm sure I healed as quickly as possible and with as little suffering as possible for myself and my family because everyone paid such close attention to me and us. They really knew me, helped me understand what steps I could take, cheered me on, comforted me, and so much more. They kept my family and me informed very well. We want that from every patient. So that's the healthcare future that I think we all imagine and hope for. Thank you.
I, Our next speaker is Dr. Lachlan Jane, who will be telling us how protocols kill the patient.
I noticed my title had a little bit of a different tenure than some of them. Are there any medical anthropologists out there? Other medical anthropologists? No, okay. Well, I'm here to tell you a little bit about medical anthropology and how we might think about this topic. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for having me here. It's really a pleasure. Medical anthropology has various ways to describe the different sorts of practices and systems that sick people are called to inhabit. Many of you have read Susan Sontag, who talks about the kingdom of the well and the kingdom of the ill, and she talks about how sooner or later we will all have to carry this passport into the kingdom of the ill. Charles Rosenberg, who's a historian at Harvard, a medical historian, writes of the tyranny of diagnosis, by which he meant diagnosis can force people into these bureaucratic kinds of systems and various systems of expert knowledges. And through the diagnosis, we then gain access to drugs or insurance and ways of understanding ourselves and the world. And these often have to be learned in much the same way as a new language or a new culture needs to be learned. We need to learn how to behave, how to get what we need, how to say where we are on the pain scale so that we get the amount of drugs that we want, how to advocate for ourselves, or how to find people to advocate for us, and so on. So as we all know, the medical system can be a place of comfort and of cure, but the kingdom of the ill can also be a dangerous place. Ill people suddenly find themselves on the phone for hours with insurance companies, and there's a high chance of bankruptcy or losing jobs for people with chronic illnesses. Researchers have found medical error to be as high as the third largest cause of death in the United States. And all of these issues fundamentally affect what it is to be sick in the U.S., even for wealthy folks for whom the correlations aren't quite as clear. So many of you work in this every day and are all too well aware of the ways in which we need to consider compassion in the context of vast systems of economics, of knowledge production, of politics, of industry. We might say that healthcare workers become the human face of these systems. So in that sense, doctor communication is a huge part, obviously, of how patients come to feel cared for. But that communication takes place within webs of power that are often even beyond our ken. So in my 10 years of study on cancer, I've also sort of found that this communication could potentially improve with a deeper understanding of cancer culture. And by cancer culture, I mean something that's much broader than just these dividing cells that we tend to think of as cancer itself. In his memoir about his mother, Susan Sontag's death from chemotherapy-induced leukemia, David Reef writes about the infantilizing language of an information pamphlet on the cancer. He writes, "The gap here between language and reality is simply too great and is actually a disservice to most patients and their loved ones, and I suspect even for physicians and nurses as well. It may be appropriate to redirect a small child who is upset about something. It is not appropriate to redirect an adult cancer patient." Now, this is perhaps an extreme case, although it's something I heard quite a few times in my research about how the pamphlets don't really reflect the reality of what people are undergoing. And in my research, I've been particularly focused on trying to get a better understanding of two different things. First is how different ways of knowing fundamentally shape the ways in which people live inside the world of cancer and its treatments. And I found that one's location in structures of knowledge and expertise can have huge consequences on what is often experienced as a kind of violence in the cancer medical world. And I want to talk more about that in a second. But my second line of investigation has been to work out the critical stakes involved in how cancer is more than this set of dividing cells, but is this whole culture. So, for example, chemotherapy and radiation are, as you know, both derived from military innovations, that is to say, from weaponry. And this history is also dramatically and painfully tied in with the ways in which cancer patients were for decades treated often as experimental subjects, and indeed still do undergo excruciating experimental treatments that are often unlikely to extend their lives. That's just a fact of the history of cancer treatments that we're just as well to acknowledge and to see how it continues to influence the ways in which we understand illness. So a huge part of the story of cancer, and one that we may prefer to tell as solely a story of scientific progress, is actually much, much more complicated than that. Now, many patients come to experience this complicated relationship between expertise in the cancer world and scientific uncertainty about the disease in the most excruciating ways. And they're asked to hold a sort of cognitive dissonance about what might have caused a cancer, for example. So that both matters and it doesn't matter. We have suspicions but no proof, but it's a central part of what it is to live for many people in and with that disease. Or the confusion about treatment side effects that often patients report not understanding very well, not being able to have access to resources that can help them understand and deal with those better. And these confusions and cognitive dissonance, what I'm describing as cognitive dissonances, are in addition to the more clear-cut, if still incredibly difficult, decisions about whether to plan for a future or how to write a will or whether or not a particular treatment will work. So despite news articles promising a cure since at least 1907, scientists continue to furiously debate how cancer arises, whether it should be studied as one disease or hundreds, whether mice provide adequate research models, and who might benefit from the arsenal of commonplace, if dangerous, cancer treatments. So the word's tangibility dissolves in sheer bafflement for doctors and patients alike over what exactly this word and this concept describes. And yet, this cloud of uncertainty is so often cast aside, and cancer is presented and assumed to be a disease that we can pin down, that we can know, better yet, cure or prevent. So the patient is thought to, in popular culture in particular, battle cancer, as if he might harness some inner strength and agency to cure himself. The story of cancer medicine is often told as one of unalloyed progress and discovery. And we're fed, as you know, a daily diet in the newspapers on how we can avoid cancer by undergoing screening or by avoiding alcohol. So much as we may wish to ignore it, I found that the unknown, as much as the known, constructs how we, and by we I mean all of us, understand and live in cancer in ways I believe that we probably would be better off acknowledging. Certainly the paradoxes that cancer hands us need to be better understood. The complex and problematic alliances of profits in medicine, the lack of regulations around known carcinogens, and the dearth of knowledge about how cancer starts and spreads. But more than this, the unknowns are not merely innocent areas of research that need to be done, but can be understood as crafted and as acting in similar ways that knowledge does. And I want to tell you about an experience I've had, a couple of experiences that kind of indicate, I think, this vast divide that some of us have been talking about today between the patient knowledge or even patient intuition and scientific knowledge or scientific intuition that I think that can shed light on this question of how best to approach this question of compassion. And it's one of the paradoxes that I've really had to think about a lot in my presentations over the last few years. I started doing research many, many years ago for part of my PhD dissertation. I was very interested in cigarettes and product liability law. But I first started writing the book that I just finished. It's called Malignant, How Cancer Becomes Us, when I underwent cancer treatment in my mid-30s for a fairly late diagnosed cancer. And the question for me is often, especially before I wrote the book, I sort of came out with the book, but was a question of whether to come out as someone who'd gone through treatment or not to come out as someone who'd gone through treatment. And that dramatically affected the ways in which that small thing, seemingly small thing, the way in which people understood and reacted to the things that I was saying. And they can be quite vicious, actually. So in a radio commentary that I did last year on NPR, the radio commentary was I thought, fairly benign. It was about the sort of demise of Lance Armstrong and suggesting that it might open the way for new ways of thinking about survivorship, because as you probably know, Lance Armstrong has been very powerful in that community for good, and I think for good and ill, people respond to it differently. So I wasn't saying anything that was opposed too much about that version of survivorship, but just arguing for a proliferation of ways of living with cancer. And one of the comments I got was, actually two of the comments were so vituperative back. One of them was like, she should get cancer and then she would know, you know. So there's that side of it, and then there's the other side of it when I do come out as someone who's gone through cancer treatment, that my work can be dismissed as not objective enough, or if I talk about a particular experience, that experience can just simply be dismissed as my experience rather than a window upon which we can reflect on something larger that's going on in the cancer world. So, you know, I think bristly survivors make a valid point for how could you understand the scene of the radiation room, the frail gown that had surely covered someone for whom this very treatment hadn't worked, now inelegantly smothers your unease about the dose the machine is emitting and strains to catch the shiver that threatens to displace the crimson rays from the tumor. The soft rock radio's ionizing thrum replaces the technicians who moments ago trust you like a Christmas turkey before saying that's probably good enough and pressing the button to elevate your scarcely clad prone body higher into the frigid cement vault before bustling down the leaded hallway to cluster in the teddy bear garnished booth as the machines start to tick and squeal. I, for one, would have not been able to grasp being an object in other people's daily work lives, a slippery-veined, wriggly mound from which to draw blood, a back-wrenching load on a difficult-to-steer bed, needing conveyance from one department to another, had I not gone through the experience myself. I won't soon forget the doctor who meticulously peeled and then sucked on each in a pile of Hershey's Kisses as he reeled off the statistical likelihood that radiation treatment would work versus the likelihood that it would produce more and other kinds of cancer. The data simply means something different if you are collecting it than it means if your life or death will become that data. So, not exactly predetermined, each of cancer's scenarios funnel possible experiences. From the radiation room to the support group, each new role offers new requirements of physical and emotional discipline, masochism, and passivity. For these reasons, a kind of recognition emerges among people who may identify as cancer survivors, akin to the knowing winks that parents of adult children give those quieting, screaming toddlers. And that's what I'm interested in, is how can we make both of these forms of knowledge count? How can we learn from one another in these complex systems that are so far beyond our apprehension? The places which I've found that compassion in healthcare has been most successful have been those places at which the paradoxes raised by different forms of knowing are acknowledged and considered in all of their complexity, contradiction, and heartbreak. And that's not easy because of the ways that knowledge moves through institutions. So the same statistic that will mean something completely different in a legal case as it means in a randomized control trial as it does in a doctor's office when one person is giving the others their likelihood for survival. Yet we can learn something from the sort of cognitive dissonance that cancer forces us into. For that dissonance appears when we think about the carcinogen-laden environments in which we all live and the statistics that continually bombard us with the likelihood that we will die in a car crash, and the endlessly generated randomized control trials that give us incremental survival differences with this or that chemotherapy. In other words, these studies, numbers, protocols demand that we inhabit them in ways that centrally shape what cancer is, and in ways that we need to better understand if we're to build a more compassionate understanding of illness. So I'm suggesting that real compassion will also require a radical rethinking of how we do and think healthcare in America. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kyra Bobinet, a good friend of mine, and she's going to talk to us about how to build compassion into our healers.
So basically, I'm here because I feel very strongly inspired by this movement. And the thing I have to say to you, everyone here, is that I'm overwhelmed by this many people willing to spend this much time on this topic. And I am super excited about what you're going to do with this going forward and how you're going to change in your spheres of influence the world. And so I say that because what I'm going to share with you, I'm going to basically drop my guard and be more vulnerable with you than I otherwise would be if you were not doing that after this. So I run a behavior design firm called Engaged In that I sprouted out at Stanford. And it was 20 years of pursuing why it is that we don't do what we should do for health. And I noticed this even before medical school when I would volunteer with patients, pregnant teens, vets at the VA, that kind of thing, that there's this gap between what we say we want to do and what we actually do. And in that gap pours all of our shame and all of our frustration and all of our disappointment. This is the human condition. So in thinking about what it would take to build up our healers in this society, I have 3 suggestions. 2 have been touched on a little bit, so I'm going to scoot right by those, but I do want to touch on them just for completion's sake. 1 is do no harm. I believe that people are coming into the field of healthcare and coming into the role of healer with a good intention and with compassion inherent in their being. And I know this because I used to volunteer with and then run a program for incarcerated youth. And you would imagine that these are, repeat violent offenders who have done the most heinous things in certain moments of their life. But also what you don't know about them maybe is that this one young man, Damien, gave a homeless man $1 when he had 2 and no other source of income. So how many of you can say that you've given 50% of your net worth to a person on the street who you don't know what they're going to do with it? And I asked him why he did that, and he said, well, I just if I've got something on me, I can't leave somebody without something. That was his attitude. So I do think that the intention is universal to be helpful. And even if you look at the ice bucket challenge, right, that tapped a latent need to help or feel powerful or feel participatory, and it was silly. But we wanted an excuse to express that side of ourselves. And yet we have to protect these students or these incoming interns, whoever they are, who are coming into the field of wanting to aspire to be a healer, because they can come up against very, very violent experiences. Myself, I was screamed at in the pediatric ICU for trying to go to a 10-year-old who'd been hit by a car and was in a coma and being lavaged and violently thrashing about. And I was screamed at for leaving rounds. And I will never forget that, because I almost failed that rotation. It was my first one back to clinical. And a very dear friend of mine who helped me get through medical school, actually, Shoshi Zelman, raise your hand, or a little tiny wave. If you missed it, she went like this. One of the most compassionate healers I have ever met, one of the most emotionally intelligent people I have ever met. And I'm sure the same thing goes true for all of you. I just don't know that about you yet. But we have to protect and shield these very true hearts from enduring any sort of damage, because we want them to be intact on the other end. And that leads to the second point, which is reward compassion. And the panel before us talked a lot about the structures of that. And in our work as a design firm, we essentially do designs that allow these good intentions to come through into behaviors and behavior change. So we do this kind of work where you design an environment, you make sure that the triggers are all right, you make sure that the ease is right, you make sure that the motivation is all being tapped and fostered and cultivated. So those are all kind of covered. The third thing, though, that I haven't heard, and maybe was mentioned before I got here, is self-compassion. And I know that there's practices of loving kindness for oneself and others and that kind of thing, you know, yada, yada, yada. I've been a meditation practitioner since '99. I did different bouts of trying to understand what it means to be compassionate with yourself. Because the first time I was inspired to, understand what self-love was, because it was pointed out to me by another medical student friend of ours, actually, that we just went to a retreat with, that I had a biting tongue, meaning that I was critical. And this makes sense because I was raised in a critical family with a lot of verbal abuse and things like that. So of course it leaks out of my mouth, you know. But I wanted to fix it because I realized from her feedback that I was hurting my friends, I was hurting other people. I wanted to be safe to be around. And so I went on a 9-day solo camp in the Rocky Mountains on a search, a literal vision quest for self-love. I, every morning before dawn, crawled up on this gigantic boulder, sat up and did sun salutations until the sun came up, and it felt empty. For 9 days I did this. On the 9th day, before I had to walk out, I was sitting in meditation on this one rock, and this little chipmunk was chasing this other little chipmunk, and they literally just scurried up over my body and down over as if I wasn't there. So something had shifted that made me safe, that they picked up on because of my commitment to this quest. But I came back, and I went back to my old ways, and I criticized everybody, and, flash forward a couple of years, right? Then about 5 years later, I was going on a nature walk, and I had been, again, seeing evidence that my critical tongue or those kinds of things were not working for me. And I would have flashbacks of things I would say to people or things I had done or even things I'd experienced in my past that were very painful to reflect upon. So as I was walking out, I just decided to spontaneously sit somewhere in the woods. And there was this tiny little nest, this hummingbird nest. It's the only one I've ever seen. They're like this big, they're super little bitty, because hummingbirds are that big, right? And of course, they have tiny little eggs, too. It's the cutest thing in nature I've ever seen. And I sat underneath that little nest, and I reflected on each of these moments that was super painful. And I kind of just spontaneously sat next to myself, proverbially, in those scenes. So if one happened in 1981, I would be sitting there next to myself as a child, and I would say, I forgive you for not having the courage enough to stand up to your dad when he talked to you that way. And then flash forward, I forgive you for lying about your homework because you were too ashamed that you were, in a fight the night before with your mom. I forgive you for manipulating that person. I forgive you for being arrogant. I forgive you for being so insecure. I just went through all of the things that was just so painful to look upon, and I just embraced myself. And as you could imagine, as I went through each scene, more and more tears kind of came down my face. Just a typical Saturday in Concord, California. And I walked back home, and I have to say something shifted from that point forward. And I would just propose that the elephant in the room here is that we as doctors, we as people who are very, very driven to help other people, run out of compassion for ourselves, and then that's when we stop helping others. So I realized that my ability to give, the gas in my tank to give to others, is the exact level of my self-compassion. And when I burn through that or don't replenish that through my own negative self-talk or not taking care of myself, those kinds of things, or my environment is very toxic, whatever it is that drains that out, that's when I stop giving. That's when I start being passive-aggressive. That's when I start being judgmental. That's when I start shutting down and defending myself. So I'm half Native American, and one of my elders once said, hurt people hurt people. And I would say conversely, cared for people care for people. And that care has to come from your own self as if it was the patient that you're trying to take care of. You have to treat yourself with equanimity so that everybody gets some. It cannot be a draining exercise. Do I have a few seconds? Okay, I'm going to do a little song. You guys are going to sing. Ready? I'm going to do just a call and response. I want everybody to clap with me. Plant this tree in your own yard, in your neighbor's yard, anywhere, everywhere, everywhere you go. And one day, they will all say, happiness was here. Someone happy, happy planting tree. Happy planting tree. Go.
Can someone tell me why I can never clap at the right? This has been a struggle for me my whole life. Thank you. Thank each of you. I think we've experienced a lot today. I think it's, at least for me, and I hope for all of you, this has been powerful in the sense that it has given you insights into the power of compassion, the science of it, and also will imbue each of you with perhaps some insights and tools that will allow you to go forth from here and help you in your own journey and path. I would like to open this to questions or comments. And you know, it's always interesting when you ask people for questions, there's invariably people, they don't ask the question, they just want to make a comment. So today I'm asking for questions and comments as well from anyone in the audience. It could be also just your own thoughts on what you've experienced today, or potentially its effect, or maybe just an idea of how we could look at things in a different way or a more helpful way. So please feel free.
I just wanted to thank Kyra. We've heard about vocalization and breath, and you had the courage to bring that to us as a group, and I really appreciate that.
I just want to honor and thank all of the participants, but I want to answer a question that was posed in the room, because we've heard some inspiring examples of what can happen if you have an executive leader that just with huge courage and integrity role models compassion and drives it down through the organization. But the reality is that that is an extremely rare occurrence in the healthcare world. In the New Zealand healthcare system, we have 20 public health boards and 20 public health chief executives. Of those, 2 have invited us into their organization. 1 left to go as well, so that work was dead. The other was committed to our work, and then his budget was cut $40 million, and that was the end of it. So there is no place in New Zealand currently where there is a chief executive who's supporting our work. Well, what I want to offer is a response to that, because that's the reality of all of us, is that I want you to think of this work as a social movement within your organization. We talk about the system out there as if it's separate from us. It's not. We are the system. And in little ways, we can begin to strengthen ourselves. The most powerful thing we can do is to attend to our own healing and well-being and be a radiant beacon of joy in a workplace, because that's contagious. And to connect in small groups that start to give other people courage and encouragement and share some practices, and think of this as a social movement within your organization. So even if you work in the London School of Economics, there is hope. Thank you.
Any other thoughts or, yes?
Hi, I'd like to thank everyone for their participation. This for me has been very healing and a much needed break. I work as a patient advocate all across the country. I think that compassion in healthcare is going to be more needed than ever. We didn't touch upon, but I'm sure everybody is aware of what exists, what everybody is facing now between what's coming out of Washington with supposed healthcare reform and how big healthcare organizations are, in my opinion, maneuvering around that. I think that when I see things like a charge master price list, that I'm fighting for people to stay out of bankruptcy, and sometimes even wealthy people, to touch upon Dr. Jain's comments, there really isn't a lot of compassion that I see in healthcare where people are helped from a life care perspective of how do you incorporate planning for your life with compassion, not only as it relates to your health care, but how your whole life is going to unfold. And the work that we're talking about, I think, is extremely important, but even more pressing because of the forces that are working against us. The gentleman from the London School of Economics, his points are well taken. Our charge master is out of control. Washington is passing legislation that allows for patients to be observed under observation when they don't even know what that means, only to be saddled with large bills afterward. And I think it's extremely important that we all take to heart, even though the system writ large is huge and powerful, I, for one, and encourage everyone here to never underestimate just what one person can do to help one patient on any given day, because those are the tiny bits of sand that I hope will create a mountain. So thank you, and I think a lot is at stake, and it's all the more reason why we have to be very diligent.
Thank you.
So we are the magic and we are the light in healthcare. And as she spoke of the hummingbird, if you've noticed a hummingbird, it kind of has our pace. We're all frantic every day. We're all running around and just feel like we can't do anything more, and we're all at our breaking point. But the hummingbird always pauses for sweetness. The hummingbird will find that drop of sweetness that sustains its life. And a hummingbird will stop, but it cannot carry anything. So we have to take care of ourselves to quit carrying the burden of our broken system into our homes, and it breaks our hearts. So for each of us, there are many things stopping us and overwhelming us. But each day, what we can do is pause for that bit of sweetness for ourselves and give that bit of sweetness back to somebody else, be it a coworker, be it a patient, be it the person who gives you a call to sell some horrible product. Just be that piece of sweetness.
I want to thank you all. This has been extraordinary. For my intent and purposes, once is not enough. Having heard your talks and furiously trying to take notes, Dr. Doty, will these talks be, I see we have videotapes, will these be available to the public or to us? And if not, in the form of video, can we get some of the slides?
I just need to see your insurance card.
Okay.
Yes, they will be on our website. They will be available. We are happy to share. If you actually go to our website, any of you who have not, there is an immense depth of content there regarding a variety of domains and certainly healthcare, and this will be available to everyone.
Great, thank you. And how can we support your work?
Money.
Okay.
You know, certainly good intention supports our work. And, you know, somebody asked me one time that question, and honestly, obviously, money does do that. But what I think actually is even more important is each of you has power. And the problem with many of us is we do not recognize the power that we in fact have. The power to share, the power to communicate, the power to inspire. And if each of you go forth, we will take what I say today is the start of an age of compassion. You know, we had the age of enlightenment. I believe that we are at the start of the age of compassion. And certainly in healthcare, we need that, but we need it everywhere. And if each of you commits as the path or mission in your life to carry that torch, you know, I say to people sometimes, every human being has a glimmer of light that represents love, compassion, caring. And for so many in healthcare especially, it gets burned down where you can barely see a glimmer, but it is always there. And if we go forth to give people the support, the care, and be there for them, it will turn into a beacon that will attract so many others. So while money is wonderful, I would simply ask you to be a beacon for this work. Thank you, each of you. Thank you to our sponsors. I appreciate it. Take care. Thank you all so much.